Hello and welcome to Runkle of the Bailey. My name is Ian Runkle. I'm a Canadian criminal defense and firearms lawyer. Today what I want to talk about is the announcement that there's not going to be any charges with respect to the arrest of a woman who was wearing a Stormtrooper costume as part of a May the 4th promotion for a Star Wars themed restaurant. Now, I'm not going to include the video here. I may link it probably in the description below. However, what was happening here is a Star Wars themed restaurant was, again, having a promotion. And so they had a woman dressed up as a Stormtrooper with a toy blaster outside, sort of trying to direct business towards the restaurant. Somehow, apparently, a couple of people made 911 calls about, a weapon. And we don't have those 911 calls. And I'm kind of upset about that because it would be really nice to find out what actually was said in those. Did they say, for instance, this person is in front of a Star Wars themed restaurant dressed as a Stormtrooper? Because these seem like details that maybe would have been communicated to a dispatch. Certainly if I was calling 911 about anybody, somebody's breaking into my house, if they were dressed up as a Wookiee, I would mention that to the dispatcher. Oh, by the way, he's also wearing, whatever kind of costume, if they were wearing a costume. So I assume that was probably passed on to the dispatcher and almost certainly to the officers as well. This really should get you thinking, because when I think of somebody wearing, a costume, I don't think actual gun, I think toy gun. Now, the police, of course, have to be a little cautious. They've got to worry about what if it's a real gun. So they roll up to investigate, and all of this I have no problem with. I also have no problem with the fact that they direct her to drop the gun. Fair enough. They want to make sure that she's separated from that. In some reports, some of the reports I was seeing from the time had said that she was uncooperative or that she maybe didn't hear them and didn't drop the toy. However, there's a little bit of video out there, and she clearly has dropped the toy substantially before sort of what takes place next, which is that the police at that point decide that they want to take control of her. They want to put her in handcuffs, and they direct her to get onto the ground, which she's having extreme difficulty doing because she's in a costume. If you've ever worn any sort of costume armor, it tends to be very restrictive and make it very difficult to move, including, or especially to do things like kneeling or, so forth. So she has trouble with that and eventually gets down to kneeling, and they want her to go further down, so they take her down to the concrete, at which point she gets a bloody nose. There's pictures out there that have her blood on the concrete. One really wonders whether those steps were necessary, because when you look at it, sure, maybe they've got to separate her from what they're not sure if it's a weapon or not. But, she drops it, they can check it out, they can say, hey, this is a toy. And at that point, maybe a conversation is the key thing to have, not throwing her to the ground and throwing cuffs on her. It's difficult to see how that was necessary or how that was something that seemed like a good idea at the time. Part of policing needs to be situational awareness. Look around. And situational awareness might be something like, hey, those people are, a danger. But it can also be things like, hey, we're out front of a Star Wars themed restaurant. Maybe, just maybe, something else is going on other than this is a danger. Maybe we should ratchet our force down. Now, looking a little bit at the criminal code here, Section 25 is an important section. It talks about protection of people acting under authority. So everyone who is required or authorized by law to do anything in the administration or enforcement of the law, either as a private person, which doesn't usually apply, as a peace officer or public officer, or in aid of a peace officer or public officer, or by virtue of his office. So this is a section that largely exists to protect police officers who need to use force. And it says, is, if he acts on reasonable grounds, justified in doing what he was required or authorized to do, and in using as much force as is necessary for that purpose. It's difficult for me to see that it was necessary to use force in this circumstance, so I think charges could have been laid here. I think from my review of the video that there's a reasonable prospect of conviction here. That said, the likely penalty on this, if there was a conviction, would probably be a conditional discharge, something that, ultimately they don't get a record, assuming that they complete the discharge successfully, which I'd expect from a police officer. I don't expect that they would have that much difficulty. So there may have been some public interest weighing in terms of whether or not they wanted to pursue charges. However, the public interest of not laying charges always kind of seems to be weighted a little more heavily than it would be for you or I, somebody who's not a police officer. The other thing is that, in my view, because the police have had such problems with accountability, the way you solve that is by actually holding them to account when they do things wrong. And so there may be a public interest ground to bring the charges, but that ultimately is not the direction they went. I wasn't, of course, privy to those discussions. I don't know why they decided not to bring charges or what was involved, but that's kind of my thinking on the issue. If I was, the person making this call, I probably would have erred on the side of, what, let's bring the charges. Let's have this heard in a court, because ultimately, I mean, there's a woman who was harmed, who was traumatized. Some of the news reports say that, the officers haven't even apologized. I don't know if that's accurate, but that's what I've seen reported in the news. And if so, I mean, that's kind of concerning when we're talking about police relationships with the public. And another thing that this case makes me kind of think of is the case of the Queen in Falauca. And I've done videos on this before. I'll try to link it here. But that's a case where the Supreme Court said that trying to conceal a firearm because you're transporting it because you don't want to alarm people, you're not trying to hide it for a nefarious purpose, but you're trying to hide it so that you don't generate fear among the public. The Supreme Court said that's a crime. So that's something I think about here because, for instance, if I need to take, my gun to the gun store because I'm going to sell it for consignment, and let's say there's no parking right directly in front of the gun store. Let's say I have to walk a block with this gun to get it into the gun store. Am I going to have my face slammed into the concrete by officers just because I am following the law? I hope not. I don't like that kind of thing. So, again, this seems like a situation where really more of a priority needed to have been put on de-escalation and on understanding. What are we actually looking at here when we're seeing something unusual? They just kind of decided that this was a dangerous, deadly threat. And it doesn't look like anybody sort of stopped to say, wait a minute, are we the baddies here? Are we actually about to cause injury and harm to a very, a completely innocent woman? She's never been charged with anything. Nobody suggested that there was any crime here. I can't certainly think of an offense that she was committing. I mean, she's just helping out the business she works for and so forth. So, yeah, I mean, this is a baffling situation, and it's one that I also think raises the risk of people fearing the police. People shouldn't be afraid of the police. People should, have a better view of the police. But if you can't go and do sort of innocent, fun things like this without worrying about the cops showing up and, leaving you in tears and bloody, that's a problem. I don't like that for our society. Anyway, thank you for watching. Please like this video. Please share it with your friends. Please subscribe to see more content. I'm going to leave, as I said, a link to an article here. There's also going to be a link to my Patreon. I want to thank my Patreon supporters at the $50 level: D. Moe, People of Canada, Sir Daniel Wicks of Alberta, Canada's National Firearms Association, Toronto Airsoft, and Rail. And at the $20 level, Cameron Johnson, Kevin Fleet, and Dale Nesbitt, as well as the $10 supporters who will be in the crawl immediately following. Thank you once again for watching. I hope that this has armed you with knowledge.